What happens when a man who has served his country for 3 decades is told he doesn't belong? In the quiet, all-American town of Harmony Creek, a decorated hero, seeking only a cup of coffee, collides with a local cop wrapped in a uniform of prejudice. This isn't just a story about an argument in a diner. It's about a single, hateful act that unknowingly targeted the most powerful man in the region. It's about how one man's quiet dignity in the face of ugliness unleashed a storm of consequences that would bring a town, a police force, and one arrogant officer to their knees. This is the story of how karma arrived in full-dress uniform. Harmony Creek, North Carolina, was the kind of town that prided itself on its apple pie wholesomeness. Nestled in the rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, its main street was a postcard of Americana. A barber shop with a striped pole that actually spun, a hardware store owned by the same family for 3 generations, and a town square with a gazebo and a slightly weathered bronze statue of a Civil War soldier. American flags hung from nearly every lamppost, their colors a little faded by the southern sun. But Harmony Creek had a secret, one that every resident knew but rarely acknowledged. Its charm, its economy, its very stability was a borrowed commodity. Just 5 miles up the winding Route 24 was the imposing front gate of Fort Caldwell, a massive U.S. Army installation that was the region's largest employer and its undisputed economic engine. The soldiers and their families shopped on Main Street, bought cars from the local dealership, and filled the pews of the town's churches on Sundays. The hum of helicopters and the distant thud of artillery practice were the town's background music, a constant reminder of the symbiotic, if unbalanced, relationship. This dependence bred a peculiar kind of local arrogance, most potently personified by Officer Rick Davies of the Harmony Creek Police Department. Davies was a man who seemed permanently stuck in the third act of a bad cop movie. At 42, his once athletic build had softened into a paunch that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt, and his face was set in a perpetual, condescending scowl. He had tried to join the Army himself 20 years ago, but washed out of basic training with a trick knee that never seemed to bother him when he was chasing down teenagers for skateboarding on the sidewalk. That failure had curdled into a deep-seated resentment, which he masked with an aggressive, over-the-top patriotism. He saw himself not just as a cop, but as the gatekeeper of Harmony Creek's pristine, white picket fence identity. His patrol car, a Ford Explorer, was his kingdom. He drove it with a proprietary air, one hand on the wheel, the other often resting on the butt of his sidearm. He knew everyone, or at least he thought he did. He knew which kids were likely to cause trouble, which husbands drank a little too much on a Friday night, and which faces belonged. More importantly, he knew which faces didn't. On this particular Tuesday morning, the air was thick with the promise of late summer heat. Davies was finishing up a routine traffic stop, having ticketed a young mother for going 5 miles over the speed limit near the elementary school. "You need to be more careful, ma'am," he'd said, his voice dripping with paternalistic authority. "This is a town where we look out for our children." The woman, flustered and close to tears, had simply nodded and taken the ticket. The interaction left Davies with a familiar surge of satisfaction. He was the guardian, the protector. He decided to swing by the corner booth, the town's beloved diner, for his mid-morning coffee. It was his unofficial office, a place where he could hold court, listen to gossip, and assert his presence. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, a familiar sound that usually brought a friendly greeting from the owner, Sarah Jenkins. Sarah, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a perpetually flour-dusted apron, gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Morning, Rick." "Sarah," he nodded, his eyes already scanning the room. The usual crowd was there. Old man Hemlock and his buddies arguing about politics in their regular booth, a couple of construction workers fueling up on pancakes, a young family with a toddler happily mashing scrambled eggs into his hair, and then he saw him. Sitting alone in a small booth by the window was a man Davies had never seen before. He was black, probably in his early 50s, with a strong, athletic build that his simple civilian clothes, a plain gray t-shirt and dark jeans, couldn't hide. He had a graying, close-cropped haircut and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was reading a paperback novel, a pair of simple reading glasses perched on his nose, a half-empty mug of coffee on the table beside him. He looked calm, self-contained, and utterly out of place in Rick Davies's carefully curated world. A slow, ugly smirk crawled across Davies's face. He saw not a man enjoying a quiet moment, but an anomaly, a problem waiting to happen. He adjusted his duty belt, the leather creaking in the quiet diner, and decided it was time to protect his town. Colonel Marcus Thorne took a slow sip of his coffee. It was surprisingly good, strong, black, and hot, without the burnt taste that so often plagued diner coffee. He'd been driving for nearly 7 hours, making the final leg of his journey from Washington, D.C. to his new post. His SUV, packed with the few personal belongings he cared most about, books, photographs of his late wife, and his dress blues carefully laid in a garment bag, was parked just down the street. After 32 years in the United States Army, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the Pentagon's sterile corridors to muddy field command posts, he was ready for this final assignment, commander of Fort Caldwell. It was a prestigious post, a capstone to a distinguished career. But more than that, he hoped it would be quiet. He was tired of deployments, tired of bureaucracy, tired of the constant pressure. He wanted to lead his soldiers, serve his country, and maybe find a decent place to fish on the weekends. He had decided to drive into Harmony Creek before officially checking in at the base. He wanted to see the town not as a commander, but as a resident, to get a feel for the place his soldiers and their families would call their temporary home. The corner booth diner seemed like the perfect place to start. It smelled of bacon and old-fashioned hospitality. The waitress who took his order, a teenager named Chloe with a nervous energy, had been polite enough. He'd ordered a simple breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, bacon, wheat toast, and coffee. While he waited, he pulled out the novel he'd been reading, a worn copy of a John D. MacDonald thriller. It was a small comfort, a habit he'd cultivated over decades in places far from home. A book could build a wall of privacy around you, even in a crowded mess hall or a bustling airport. He was a man accustomed to being watched, but also skilled at becoming invisible when he chose. In civilian clothes, stripped of the rank and ribbons that defined his professional life, he was just another man. A black man, yes, and he was under no illusions about what that meant in certain parts of the country. He'd faced his share of prejudice over the years, from resentful subordinates to suspicious glances in unfamiliar towns. But he had always met it with a calm, unshakable dignity that he'd learned from his father, a man who had served in a segregated army. "Never let them steal your peace, son," his father had told him. "Your peace is yours. Don't give it away for free." So he sat, reading his book, enjoying his coffee, and observing the quiet life of the town. He noticed the easy familiarity between the other patrons, the way they greeted each other by name. He heard snippets of conversations about a high school football game, a sick neighbor, the rising price of feed. It was the rhythm of a small town, a rhythm he found comforting. This could be a good place, he thought, a good final chapter. His breakfast arrived, and it was as honest and unpretentious as the coffee. The eggs were perfect, the bacon crisp. He ate slowly, savoring the simple meal. He was just about to signal the waitress for a coffee refill when the bell above the door chimed, and a shadow fell across his table. He looked up from his book, his eyes adjusting from the page. A police officer stood there, blocking the light from the window. The man was stocky, with a sour expression and eyes that seemed to be searching for a fight. "Morning," Colonel Thorne said, his voice even and calm. He offered a slight, polite nod. The officer, Davies, didn't return the greeting. He just stared, his gaze sweeping over Thorne from head to toe, lingering for a moment on his dark skin before flicking back to his face. The air in the diner seemed to shift. The cheerful chatter dropped a few decibels. The clinking of cutlery slowed. "You're not from around here," Davies stated. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Thorne closed his book, placing it gently on the table. He folded his hands and looked directly at the officer. "Just passing through," he replied, his voice still quiet, betraying no hint of irritation. "Enjoying a fine breakfast." Davies's lips curled into a sneer. "Passing through to where? We get a lot of people just passing through." Sometimes they forget to keep going. Colonel Thorne felt a familiar weariness settle over him. It was the old tired script, the assumption of guilt, the demand for justification. He had hoped for a moment that Harmony Creek might be different. He was already being proven wrong, but his father's words echoed in his mind. Don't let them steal your peace. He would not give this angry, bitter man his peace. The sudden tension in the corner booth was as thick as the grease in the fryer. The regulars who moments before had been loudly debating the mayor's new parking meter initiative now fell silent. They watched the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They all knew Rick Davies and his short fuse. Sarah Jenkins, the owner, nervously wiped down an already clean counter, her eyes darting between Davies and the stranger. She had a bad feeling about this. Rick was like a stray dog. If you showed fear, he'd only get more aggressive. Colonel Thorne maintained his placid demeanor, a stark contrast to Davies's bristling hostility. I assure you, officer, Thorne said, his voice smooth and measured, I have no intention of overstaying my welcome, just finishing my coffee. Davies leaned forward, placing his palms flat on Thorne's table. The move was deliberately invasive, a violation of personal space. I didn't ask about your intentions. I asked where you're headed. You got some ID on you? Thorne's eyes, which had seen men in far more threatening postures, did not waver. Is there a reason you need to see my identification, officer? Have I broken a law? This was the crucial question. It was a calm, legal challenge to the officer's authority. Thorne knew his rights perfectly well. He wasn't driving. He wasn't being detained for a suspected crime. He was a customer in a restaurant. The question seemed to enrage Davies. It was a rejection of his assumed dominance. In his mind, his uniform was the reason. His authority was absolute and shouldn't be questioned, especially not by someone like this. The reason, Davies said, his voice dropping to a low growl, is that I'm a police officer in this town, and I'm asking you for it. We have a problem with vagrancy. People come in, they buy a cheap cup of coffee, and they sit for hours, taking up space, making regular customers uncomfortable. The accusation was absurd. Thorne was well-dressed, had ordered a full breakfast, and had been there for less than 45 minutes. He glanced around the diner. Several booths were empty. He wasn't taking up space someone else needed. The regular customers weren't uncomfortable with him. They were uncomfortable with Davies. I see, Thorne said, a hint of steel now entering his tone. So you're profiling me as a vagrant. He didn't say the rest of the sentence, because I'm black, but it hung in the air between them, unspoken and undeniable. The directness of the accusation was like a slap in the face to Davies. He straightened up, his face flushing a blotchy red. I'm not profiling anyone. I'm doing my job. Now, are you going to show me some ID, or are we going to have a problem? At this point, Sarah Jenkins decided she had to intervene. Rick, he's not bothering anybody, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He's a paying customer. Just let him finish his meal. Davies shot her a venomous glare. Stay out of this, Sarah. This is official police business. Unless you want me to start looking into your health code compliance again? The threat was clear and effective. Sarah paled and fell silent, retreating behind the counter. She had a son in college and a mortgage to pay. She couldn't afford to make an enemy of Rick Davies. Colonel Thorne witnessed the exchange and his internal calculus shifted. This wasn't just about him anymore. This officer was a bully who used his badge to intimidate the very citizens he was sworn to protect. The quiet meal was over. A principle was now at stake. With a slow, deliberate movement, Thorne reached for his back pocket. Davies tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards his own weapon. Thorne ignored it. He pulled out a simple, well-worn leather wallet. He opened it, but he didn't pull out his driver's license. Instead, he took out his military ID. It was a card that identified him as a colonel in the United States Army. His name, Marcus J. Thorne, was printed clearly beneath a stern, official photograph. It was a card that commanded respect and immediate deference in any military or federal setting on the planet. But he didn't show it to Davies. He held it in his hand, his thumb covering his rank and name. He looked at Davies, then at the ID, and then he made a decision. No, this man didn't deserve to see it. He wouldn't use his rank to win a petty argument with a small-town bigot. He would deal with this as a citizen. Giving this man his military credentials now would be like casting pearls before swine. It would solve the immediate problem, but it wouldn't address the deeper sickness this officer represented. He slowly slid the military ID back into his wallet and pulled out his Virginia driver's license instead. He placed it on the table. Davies snatched it up. He studied it for a moment. Marcus Thorne, Arlington, Virginia. A long way from home, aren't you, Marcus? The use of his first name was a deliberate, calculated insult, a way of stripping him of dignity and respect. Thorne did not react. He simply waited. His calm was a fortress Davies could not breach. Davies handed the license back. All right, I'm satisfied. For now. He gestured towards Thorne's plate. Finish up and move along. We've got our eye on you. He turned, expecting to have the last word, but Colonel Thorne wasn't finished. Officer, Thorne said, his voice cutting through the diner's silence. Every patron was now openly staring. Davies stopped and turned back, an irritated look on his face. What? Your name? Thorne said. I didn't get your name. Davies's chest puffed out. He pointed to his name tag. It's Officer Davies. Not that it's any of your business. And your badge number? Thorne asked, his gaze as steady as a rifle sight. Davies's face contorted in a snarl of fury. The request for his badge number was a clear sign that this man intended to file a complaint. It was a direct challenge and one he would not tolerate. The last bit of his restraint snapped. The air crackled. Officer Davies took a step back toward the table, his body language screaming aggression. He was no longer a police officer performing a duty, however poorly. He was a man whose fragile authority had been questioned, and he was about to explode. My badge number, he spat, his voice loud enough to make the coffee cups on the counter rattle. You think you're in a position to be asking me for my badge number? You're the one who's out of line here, loitering, causing a scene, harassing a police officer. The accusations were patently false, a desperate attempt to flip the script. Colonel Thorne simply looked at him, his silence a more potent rebuttal than any argument could have been. That infuriating calm was the final match on the gasoline. You know what? I've had enough of this, Davies declared, his voice rising to a shout. I'm not just asking you to leave anymore. I'm ordering you. Get out of this diner, now. Thorne slowly placed his napkin on the table next to his half-eaten breakfast. He looked at his plate, then back at Davies. I haven't finished my meal, officer, and I intend to pay for it. You can pay at the register on your way out, Davies snarled. He took another step forward and gestured towards the door with a sharp, angry jerk of his thumb. Let's go. On your feet. Colonel Thorne pushed his chair back and rose slowly, with a fluid grace that belied his age. He stood to his full height, 6'2", and for the first time he seemed to tower over the shorter, stockier officer. He wasn't being aggressive, but his sheer presence seemed to diminish Davies, to shrink him. This visual challenge was the last straw. All pretense of professionalism vanished, replaced by raw, unfiltered prejudice. Don't you look at me like that, Davies seethed, his hand now resting on his pepper spray. He saw Thorne's quiet dignity not as a sign of strength, but as insolence. I know your type. You come into our town, you think you can do whatever you want. You think you own the place. Well, you don't. He got right up in Thorne's face, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that was somehow more chilling than his shouting. We have a certain kind of community here, a clean community, a safe community. We don't want your kind here. The words, your kind, hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was no longer about vagrancy or loitering. It was about race. Davies had finally said the quiet part out loud, and the entire diner had heard him. Old man Hemlock, who had served in Korea, shifted uncomfortably in his booth. The young mother, who Davies had ticketed earlier, pulled her child closer. Sarah Jenkins stood frozen behind the counter, her face ashen. This had gone too far. Colonel Thorne's expression remained unreadable, but a profound coldness settled in his eyes. He had faced down enemy combatants, navigated treacherous political minefields, and buried friends. He had endured. But this casual, public stripping of his humanity in a country he had sworn his life to defend was a unique kind of wound. He turned to walk towards the cash register, intending to pay his bill and leave. But Davies wasn't done. He needed a physical victory. He needed to put his hands on this man to fully assert his dominance. As Thorne passed him, Davies shoved him hard in the shoulder. "I said now," he yelled. The shove was clumsy and unprofessional, more of a barroom push than a police maneuver. Thorne, with his years of combat training, could have easily countered it, could have put Davies on the floor before he blinked. But he didn't. He allowed the push to stumble him a step. He absorbed the humiliation, his body rigid with control. To retaliate physically would be to lose. He was playing a longer game now. He reached the counter and pulled a $20 bill from his wallet, placing it on the counter. "This should cover it," he said to Sarah, his voice steady. Before Sarah could even reach for the money, Davies was there again. He grabbed Thorne's arm, his fingers digging into the muscle. "Forget the bill. The owner wants you out. Don't you, Sarah?" He looked at her, his eyes daring her to contradict him. Terrified, Sarah just gave a weak, jerky nod. "You heard her," Davies said with triumphant satisfaction. He tightened his grip and began to physically propel the colonel towards the entrance. "Let's go. Time to leave Harmony Creek." He didn't just escort him to the door. He shoved him through it, out onto the sidewalk. Thorne stumbled but caught his balance, turning to face the officer one last time through the glass door. Officer Rick Davies stood there, framed in the doorway of the corner booth, a smug, victorious sneer on his face. He had purged the unclean element. He had protected his town. He had won. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood on the sun-drenched sidewalk, the bell of the diner door still faintly echoing. He adjusted his shirt, his face a mask of cold fury and unbreakable resolve. Officer Davies had no idea who he had just assaulted. He had no idea the power that he had just challenged. He had kicked a man out of a diner, but in doing so, he had just kicked the legs out from under his entire town. The reckoning was coming, and it would be swift, silent, and absolute. Colonel Thorne stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, not moving. Passers-by glanced at him, then at Officer Davies still glaring from inside the diner, and hurried on their way, not wanting any part of the trouble. Thorne wasn't watching Davies, however. He was memorizing. He memorized the name of the diner, the street names on the corner sign, the smiling face of the mayor on a community picnic poster taped to the window. He was gathering intelligence. His mind, trained for decades to assess threats and formulate responses, was already working. Anger was a fire within him, but it was a controlled burn, fueling the cold, precise machinery of his thoughts. His personal humiliation was secondary. The primary issue was the safety and well-being of the 5,000 soldiers and their 10,000 family members who were under his command at Fort Caldwell. His people. They would shop in this town. Their children would go to school with the children of these townspeople. They would be policed by Officer Davies and his department. The officer's actions were not just an insult. They were a threat to the morale, welfare, and safety of every single person on his installation. If a decorated senior officer in civilian clothes could be treated this way, what chance did a young, 19-year-old private from Chicago or Los Angeles have? The thought sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't a matter for a simple complaint form. This was a leadership issue of the highest order. He walked calmly to his SUV, got in, and drove away, obeying every traffic law with meticulous care. He did not go to the Harmony Creek Police Department. He did not go to the mayor's office. He drove straight to the main gate of Fort Caldwell. As he pulled up to the guard post, the young military police sergeant on duty approached his window. "Welcome to Fort Caldwell, sir. May I see your ID?" Thorne handed the sergeant the same military ID he had refused to show Davies. The sergeant took one look at it, and his entire demeanor changed. He snapped to attention, his back ramrod straight. "My apologies, Colonel. We weren't expecting you for another few hours. Welcome, sir." "At ease, Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable resonance of command. "Just decided to get an early start." The gate was raised and Colonel Thorne drove on to the post he now commanded. The transformation was immediate. On Main Street, he was a nameless, faceless vagrant. Here, he was the center of the universe. Every soldier he passed recognized the eagle insignia of a full colonel and the command bumper sticker on his vehicle, offering crisp salutes. He drove directly to the installation headquarters, a stately brick building known as the Commandant's House. As he walked in, a major on his command staff rushed to greet him. "Colonel Thorne, sir, we weren't aware you were on post. We had a formal welcome briefing scheduled for 1500 hours. "Plans have changed, Major," Thorne said, stripping off the civilian jacket he wore. "Get me the post's staff judge advocate, the head of public affairs, and the garrison sergeant major. In my office. 10 minutes. "Yes, sir," the major said, already turning to make the calls. Inside his new office, a spacious, wood-paneled room adorned with the history of the base and its previous commanders, Colonel Thorne walked over to a private changing room. He unzipped the garment bag he'd brought with him. Inside were his dress blues, the Army service uniform. It was immaculate, razor-creased, and heavy with the physical representation of his 32-year career. There was the Combat Infantryman Badge, the Ranger Tab, the Master Parachutist Wings. Below them were rows of ribbons, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Silver Star for Valor, multiple Bronze Stars, the Purple Heart. Each one told a story of a place, a battle, a sacrifice. They were his history and the history of the men and women he had led. He methodically changed from the anonymous civilian into the commander. As he buttoned the jacket, settled the perfectly aligned ribbons on his chest, and placed his cap on his head, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him was not the person who had been shoved out of a diner. This was Colonel Marcus J. Thorne, commander of Fort Caldwell, and he was about to go to war for his soldiers, not with bullets or bombs, but with the full and crushing weight of his authority. Meanwhile, back in Harmony Creek, Officer Rick Davies was holding court back at the police station. He recounted the story of the diner incident to his partner, Officer Peterson, embellishing it for dramatic effect. "So I told him, 'We have standards in this town,'" Davies bragged, pouring himself a cup of stale coffee. "You should have seen the look on his face. Tried to get my badge number. Can you believe the nerve? I sent him packing right out of town." Sheriff Frank Miller, a weary man just a few years from retirement, overheard the story from his office. He sighed. He knew Rick Davies was a problem. He was overly aggressive, had a stack of minor complaints against him, and viewed the world through a prism of suspicion and prejudice. But he was also fiercely loyal and effective at intimidating the town's troublemakers. In a small department, you made compromises. "You sure that was necessary, Rick?" Miller asked, leaning against his office doorframe. "Absolutely, Sheriff," Davies said, full of self-importance. "You let one in, the whole element follows. You got to nip it in the bud. It's about protecting the town's image." Sheriff Miller just shook his head and went back to his paperwork. He had a meeting tomorrow morning that he wasn't looking forward to, a meet and greet with the new base commander from Fort Caldwell. It was an annual courtesy, a chance for the town leadership to kiss the ring and ensure the base's continued cooperation on things like the big 4th of July fireworks show, and, most importantly, the annual Harmony Creek Days Festival. The festival, heavily sponsored and attended by the base, accounted for nearly a quarter of the town's yearly tourism revenue. The new commander was some colonel from the Pentagon. Miller hoped he wasn't one of those spit-and-polish administrative types. He hoped he was a good old boy he could relate to. He made a mental note to have Davies handle security for the meeting at Town Hall tomorrow. It would look good to have a sharp presence there. He had no idea he was setting the stage for a collision of epic proportions. The next morning, the conference room at Harmony Creek Town Hall was buzzing with a nervous energy. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a politician's practiced smile, was adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Sheriff Miller stood by the door, trying to look relaxed. Several members of the town council were seated around the large oak table, whispering amongst themselves. Officer Rick Davies stood at parade rest in the corner. His uniform pressed, his boots shined. He felt a sense of pride, providing security for such an important meeting. This was what it meant to be essential. The meeting was scheduled for 0900 sharp. The town leadership was there to welcome the new commander of Fort Caldwell, Colonel Marcus Thorne. They had a gift basket prepared, filled with local jams, a bottle of North Carolina wine, and a tacky Key to the City plaque. It was all part of the annual ritual of appeasement to their powerful neighbor. "I hope this new colonel is reasonable," Mayor Thompson whispered to Sheriff Miller. "The last one was tough but fair. We can't afford any hiccups with the Harmony Creek Days partnership. I'm sure it'll be fine, Mr. Mayor, Miller said reassuringly. They're all the same, these Army guys. Just want to know we respect them. At precisely 0900, the door to the conference room opened. A young Army captain stepped in. Gentlemen, the commander of Fort Caldwell, Colonel Marcus Thorne. Every person in the room got to their feet. Mayor Thompson plastered on his widest smile, ready to extend a hand. Sheriff Miller straightened his jacket, and then Colonel Thorne walked in. He was immaculate in his Army service uniform. The deep blue jacket was adorned with so much brass and so many colorful ribbons that it seemed to almost glitter under the fluorescent lights. The silver eagle on each shoulder gleamed, signifying his rank. His face was the same stoic, unreadable mask from the diner, but now framed by the uniform of a high-ranking officer, it projected an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. A wave of stunned silence washed over the room. Mayor Thompson's smile froze, then melted from his face. His outstretched hand fell limply to his side. The town council members stared, their mouths slightly agape. Sheriff Miller felt the blood drain from his face. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of the decorated colonel before him with the vagrant his deputy had bragged about harassing yesterday. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But it was Officer Rick Davies who had the most visceral reaction. He was standing in the corner, and when Thorne entered, his entire body went rigid. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread that started in the pit of his stomach and spread like ice through his veins. His eyes widened in disbelief and horror. The man he had insulted, shoved, and forcibly ejected from a public restaurant, the man whose kind wasn't welcome in Harmony Creek, was the commander of Fort Caldwell. Colonel Thorne walked to the head of the table, his polished shoes making no sound on the carpeted floor. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He placed his command cap precisely on the table in front of him and surveyed the room. His gaze swept over the pale, shocked faces of the town leadership. Then his eyes locked with Officer Davies's. It was only for a second, but in that second, Davies felt the full weight of his colossal mistake crash down upon him. There was no recognition in the colonel's eyes, no anger, just a cold, empty dismissal. It was the look a man gives an insect he is about to crush under his heel. Davies felt a sudden, desperate urge to become invisible, to melt into the wall behind him. Thorne turned his attention back to the mayor. Mr. Mayor, Sheriff, members of the council, he began, his voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man about to deliver a verdict. Thank you for arranging this meeting. I had intended for this to be a simple, introductory courtesy call. However, events of the last 24 hours have forced a change in the agenda. The mayor swallowed hard. Colonel, welcome to Harmony Creek. Colonel Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. My arrival in your town yesterday was illuminating. It provided me with a raw, unfiltered look at the community my soldiers and their families will be interacting with. It was an educational experience. Every word was chosen with surgical precision. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. He was speaking with a chilling professionalism that was far more terrifying than any outburst would have been. I am responsible, he continued, his hands clasped behind his back, for the health, morale, and welfare of every single person serving at Fort Caldwell. Their safety, both on and off post, is my primary and non-negotiable mission parameter. I must be able to guarantee them that when they enter this town, they will be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness by the civil authorities. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the suffocating silence. As of this morning, I can no longer offer that guarantee. The statement landed like a bomb. Mayor Thompson looked like he was going to be sick. Sheriff Miller stared at the floor, the polished toes of his own shoes suddenly the most interesting thing in the world. He knew what was coming, and he knew whose fault it was. His eyes flickered over to the corner, where Rick Davies stood, pale and sweating, his world completely and irrevocably falling apart. Colonel Thorne continued, his voice maintaining its flat, inexorable tone. Therefore, effective immediately, I am implementing a number of new directives. He looked directly at Sheriff Miller, who finally forced himself to meet the colonel's gaze. First, Thorne announced, I am issuing a temporary off-limits order to all military personnel for the town of Harmony Creek. Effective at 1200 hours today, no uniformed or civilian personnel from Fort Caldwell are to patronize any business or establishment within the city limits, with the exception of emergency medical or legal requirements. This order will remain in effect pending a full and comprehensive review of the operating procedures and professional conduct of the Harmony Creek Police Department. The collective gasp from the town council was audible. An off-limits order was the nuclear option. It was an economic death sentence. It would mean thousands of soldiers and their families, the lifeblood of the town's economy, would stop spending their money at the shops, restaurants, and businesses of Harmony Creek. The grocery store, the movie theater, the auto repair shops, they would all feel the impact within days. Mayor Thompson finally found his voice, sputtering, Colonel, with all due respect, that's an incredibly drastic measure. There must be some misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Mayor, Thorne replied coolly. There is only clarity. My personnel will not be subjected to harassment or profiling by local law enforcement. Until I am satisfied that this department is capable of policing a diverse community professionally and impartially, my soldiers will stay on post or take their business to other towns in the county. He then turned his attention back to the wider group. Second, all official and unofficial cooperation between Fort Caldwell and the town of Harmony Creek is hereby suspended. This includes all joint training exercises, logistical support, and community outreach programs. He paused for effect, letting the second blow land. This also includes all base funding, personnel support, and participation in the upcoming Harmony Creek Days Festival. The event is canceled from our perspective. If the first announcement was a death sentence, this was the execution. The festival was the town's crown jewel. Without the base's financial backing, the military band, the static vehicle displays that drew huge crowds, and the thousands of attendees from the fort, it would be a catastrophic failure. The town would lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. Colonel, please, the mayor begged, his face slick with sweat. We can talk about this. Whatever happened, whatever the incident was, we can fix it. We can apologize. Apologies are for mistakes, Mr. Mayor, Thorne said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying an edge of cold fury for the first time. What I witnessed yesterday was not a mistake. It was a choice. It was a reflection of a culture that I cannot and will not expose my people to. Finally, he looked back to the corner of the room, directly at the man who was the source of it all. Sheriff Miller, your officer in the corner, Officer Davies. He was the agent of my educational experience yesterday at the Corner Booth Diner. He informed me in no uncertain terms that my kind was not welcome in this town. Every head in the room swiveled to stare at Rick Davies. He looked like a trapped animal, his face a mask of pure panic. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Sheriff Miller felt a surge of white-hot anger at his deputy, followed by a wave of utter despair. It was all true. The whole town was going to pay for Rick's pathetic bigotry. Sheriff, Colonel Thorne continued, his eyes still locked on Davies, the security review of your department will begin with a formal inquiry into the conduct of Officer Davies. I will be requesting all records pertaining to his service, including any and all previous citizen complaints. My staff judge advocate will be in contact with your office by noon. He gathered his cap from the table. The meeting was over. He had delivered his terms. They were unconditional. Colonel Thorne, wait, Sheriff Miller said, his voice hoarse. What do you want from us? What will it take to fix this? Colonel Thorne stood at the door, turning back one last time. He looked at the room of panicked, desperate civil servants. He let the silence hang for a long moment. Actions have consequences, Sheriff, he said, his voice flat and final. You have a cancer in your police department. I suggest you cut it out. Whether or not this town recovers is up to you. My soldiers are no longer your concern. And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a smoking crater where the town's security and prosperity used to be. The hammer had fallen. The sound of its impact would echo through Harmony Creek for a long time to come. The moment the door closed behind Colonel Thorne, The stunned silence in the room erupted into chaos. "What in God's name did you do, Rick?" Mayor Thompson shrieked, his face purple with rage. He rushed towards Davies, jabbing a finger in his chest. "You just ruined this town. You single-handedly destroyed our economy." I was just doing my job," Davies stammered, backing away. "He was suspicious. I didn't know who he was." "That's the whole damn point," yelled one of the council members, a hardware store owner named Peterson. "You're not supposed to treat anyone that way, you idiot. Now my store is going to go bankrupt because you couldn't keep your racist mouth shut over a plate of eggs." Sheriff Miller grabbed Davies by the arm and dragged him out of the conference room and into the hallway, away from the furious politicians. Miller's face was a grim, stony mask. "Sheriff, you gotta believe me," Davies pleaded, his voice cracking. "I was maintaining order. He was giving me lip." "Shut up, Rick," Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Just shut your mouth. Go back to the station. Put your sidearm and your badge on my desk. You're suspended, pending investigation." "Suspended? Frank, you can't." "I just did," Miller snarled, his eyes blazing with a fury Davies had never seen before. "Now get out of my sight before I do something worse." Defeated, humiliated, and terrified, Davies slunk out of town hall. The walk to his patrol car felt like a mile. He could feel the eyes of the town council on his back, burning with hatred. The news spread through Harmony Creek like a wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone knew. The off-limits order from Fort Caldwell was the talk of the town. Sarah Jenkins at the corner booth heard it from her morning regulars. She felt a knot of guilt and fear in her stomach. She hadn't stood up to Davies, and now this was happening. By 12:01 p.m., the effect was visible. The usual lunchtime rush of soldiers in fatigues and military family members was gone. The diner was half empty. The grocery store across the street had no line. The gas station on the corner, usually doing brisk business with soldiers heading back to the base, was silent. It was an economic ghost town. The anger of the town's business owners, initially directed at the anonymous new base commander, quickly found its true target, Officer Rick Davies. Later that afternoon, Sarah Jenkins made a decision. She called Sheriff Miller's office. "Frank," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "it's Sarah from the diner. I need to talk to you, and I have the security camera footage from yesterday morning. You need to see it." An hour later, Sheriff Miller sat in his office, watching the silent, grainy video on his computer monitor. He saw it all. He saw Colonel Thorne sitting quietly, reading his book. He saw Davies' approach, aggressive and hostile from the first moment. He saw the intimidation, the nonsensical accusations, the shove, and the final humiliating ejection from the diner. The video was damning and irrefutable. It showed a gross abuse of power, motivated by nothing but pure prejudice. When Davies came in later to give his statement, he tried to lie. He claimed Thorne was belligerent, that he had made threats, that the physical contact was initiated by him. Miller let him finish his fabricated story. Then, without a word, he turned the monitor around to face Davies. Davies stared at the screen, at his own actions playing out in black and white. The blood drained from his face. He was caught. There was no escape. "Your story seems to be a little different from the video, Rick," Miller said, his voice laced with ice. "You lied in a formal statement. You abused a citizen. You brought shame and economic ruin on this town. Hand me your badge." "Frank, please," Davies begged, tears welling in his eyes. "I have a family, a mortgage. I've been on the force for 15 years. And in 15 minutes, you destroyed it all," Miller said. His heart hardened against the man who had been his deputy for so long. "You're fired, Rick. Effective immediately. Your law enforcement certification is revoked. Now get out of my station." The hard karma for Rick Davies was just beginning. Losing his job was only the first step. The next day, his name was in the local paper. The story of what he had done and the catastrophic consequences for the town was laid bare for all to see. He became a pariah overnight. When he went to the grocery store, people would turn their backs on him, abandoning their carts to move to another aisle. The clerk at the checkout counter served him in stony silence. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. His kids came home from school crying because their classmates were calling their dad a racist who ruined the town. His wife, Karen, who had long been weary of his aggressive attitude and casual bigotry, finally had enough. "I can't do this anymore, Rick," she told him, her bags already packed. "I can't live with this hate. You did this. To us. To this whole town. You did this." She left with the children to stay with her sister in another state. Davies was utterly alone. He tried to find other work, but no one in Harmony Creek or the surrounding counties would hire him. His name was Poison. He was the man who had cost them all a fortune. He fell behind on his mortgage. The bank sent a foreclosure notice. The man who had seen himself as the town's ultimate protector was now its most despised outcast, watching as the life he had built was systematically dismantled by the consequences of his own hatred. He had lost his job, his family, and his home. He was truly, finally, the vagrant he had accused Colonel Thorne of being. The story of Officer Davies and Colonel Thorne became a harsh but necessary lesson for Harmony Creek. It wasn't just about one racist cop. It was about the silent acceptance of his behavior for years. His downfall forced an uncomfortable reckoning upon the entire community. True leadership, they learned, wasn't about loud, aggressive dominance. It was about the quiet, unshakable dignity displayed by Colonel Thorne, a man who absorbed a hateful attack and responded not with emotion, but with decisive, strategic action that protected his people and forced a necessary change. In the end, after the firing of Davies and a public, formal apology from the mayor and the new sheriff, Colonel Thorne met with them again. He didn't come to gloat. He came with a plan: mandatory comprehensive de-escalation and anti-bias training for the entire police force, conducted by his own MPs, and the establishment of a citizens' oversight committee. The town, desperate, agreed to everything. Slowly, painstakingly, the relationship was rebuilt, this time on a foundation of genuine respect. The off-limits order was eventually lifted, but the town was forever changed, humbled, and more aware. If this story of hard karma and quiet strength resonated with you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that actions, especially those born from prejudice, always have consequences. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more true-to-life stories where justice, one way or another, is always served. What part of Officer Davies' reckoning do you think was the most fitting karma? Let us know in the comments below.